archbishop, Stephan I Crowned and Sava respectively, were preordained for sanctity by virtue of their father's holiness, resting on the words of the Apostle Paul, if the root is holy, the branches are too. The veneration of Saint Sava had a particular and far-reaching significance. Sava was perceived by his contemporaries as a holy man, charismatic ascetic, and a miracle worker during his lifetime, and an effective mediator between the Serbian community and the divine. As was usual for the third generation, the dynasty consolidated its memory in order to assert its identity and reputation. The third son of King Stephan I Crowned supported the veneration of his grandfather in order to portray his family as holy by virtue of his father's holiness. As such, Nemanjić were predestined to rule in Serbian lands. Also, during his reign, Sava's cult was reinforced. The association of the two cults rested on the ideal of the symphony of the secular and spiritual authority, embodied in one sacred family. In new texts, the current king was represented as the one being favored by Saints Simeon and Sava. Owing to that, he was their legitimate heir, even though he was the youngest child. Besides, the emerging idea of the Holy Dynasty became visible in the use of the metaphor of the tree of Jesse. The process of merging two cults was finished in the next generation. Serbian king Milutin, Simeon's great-grandchild, commissioned the cultic texts when he faced the problem of ensuring the legitimacy of his bloodline in the war with his brother. In new texts, the notion of the founder of the dynasty suffered a significant modification, where Simeon welcomed the company of his son Sava, and from that time on, they were always painted together. As a result, they formed the cult of the Holy Two, or the Holy Dyad, and became the bearers of the motif of the Holy Root. Of course, they were helpers and intercessors for the ruler and the state. Also, they became an embodiment of the Serbian sacred past. Since a century or more passed from the lives of both saints, they were commemorated as the architects of Serbian statehood, autocephaly, and spiritual identity. In addition, the need for celebrating the Serbian holy past is embodied in the genealogies of Nemanjić, which were modeled on the tree of Jesse. I will now show you the oldest one. And here, Stefan Nemanja is always presented in the bottom row of the genealogy. In the middle and left of him, you can see Sava Nemanjić. Even though Simeon and Sava were not only the only dynastic saints, the foundation of the idea of the Holy Dynasty was the holiness of its sacred root, that is, Holy Dyad. This reflects the medieval epistemology of origins, where the true value of any phenomenon is grounded at the source. These processes reached their climax in the time of the first Serbian emperor, Stefan Dušan, in the middle of the 14th century. It was then that the emphasis on the dynasty's longevity, vitality, and holiness was most needed in order to justify the imperial status of the Serbian state. Now I will show you another genealogy that was painted during his reign. And here you can see him a little bit better. In the middle of the bottom row is Stefan Nemanja, and left of him is Saint Sava. Thus, commemorating the Holy Dynasty, and especially its holy root, became a prominent part of imperial ideology. After the end of the Nemanjić dynasty, the cult of the Holy Dyad was again transformed. The heirs to the Nemanjić venerated them as their helpers and protectors at the end of the 14th and in the first half of the 15th century. Since they were the symbol of the Nemanjić dynasty and the source of legitimacy, Serbian despots emphasized their descendancy from Stefan Nemanja. Slowly, they became an embodiment of the beginning of the Serbian history. Throughout the 15th and the 16th century, one long-term change took place in the commemoration of the Holy Dyad. The faithful started to venerate the saints in the liturgy weekly instead of yearly. This shift was the expression of the need for the saints' protection in the wake of the Ottoman conquest. The reputation of Saint Sava led to the inclusion of his name in the title of the Bosnian lord Stefan Vukčić Kosača in the middle of the 15th century. Owing to the fact that the monastery Mileševa, where Sava's relics were preserved, was on his territory, Stefan Vukčić named himself the Duke of Saint Sava. Now I'll just show you, monastery Mileševa. This marks the highest form of politicization of the saint's cult. The veneration of the Holy Two, at the end of the 15th and in the 16th century, became so prominent that their commemoration became a part of the new cults. The need to stress the continuity in order to overcome the general sense of discontinuity was a consequence of the end of the Serbian medieval state in 1459. This continuity was highlighted by stating that the new holy rulers, Serbian despots in Hungarian kingdom, descended from Simeon and Sava. Also, the new saints continued and revived Serbian history that had its beginnings in none other than the Holy Diet. And this idea of the revival of the Serbian history is here represented in iconography, where on the left you can see Saint Sava, and on the right the former Serbian despot and Metropolitan of Belgrade, Maksim Branković. And now I will pass the torch to my colleague Ognjen. Thank you.
So, hello. I will now share. Just a moment. Okay. Okay. The sense of discontinuity was not only caused by political change, but even greater impact had this essentially different social and cultural system in which the Serbian Church unitary found themselves upon the incorporation into the Ottoman Empire. Religious institutions can be regarded from a certain point as an integral part of Ottoman system of taxation, as all archbishops and bishops received patents of appointment from a ruling sultan. There existed several parallel church hierarchies among the sultan's Orthodox subjects, and as the highest Serbian prelates, the patriarchs of faith had to protect the scope of their rights and their territorial jurisdiction in a competition with other ecclesiastics confirmed directly by the sultan, in the first place the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople. It should be stressed that the Ottoman ruling elites were not interested in the internal organization of the church, and that they showed neither the intention nor they possessed real means to interfere into the liturgical and ideological aspects of its functioning. Thus, the use of an array of symbols and ideas stemming from the already mythologized medieval past was directed towards Orthodox clergy and believers, and in some instances as a response to ever stronger Catholic pressure. Basing patriarch's authority upon the medieval traditions was one of the most important ways in which that authority gained legitimacy in this context of intra and interfaith relations. And the bond with the Holy Diet was a powerful symbol of that legitimacy. On the one hand, the throne of the patriarch was that of Saint Sava. On the other, the institution of church was presented as a continuation of traditions of Nemanjić state founded by Saint Simeon. In a hymn dedicated to Saint Sava and composed during the last decade of the 16th century, the person of the saint is strongly connected with the ideas of fatherland and autonomous church organization. The literary work of Patriarch Paisius, 1614-1647, can be seen as the best representation of religious, culture, and political trends current among his contemporaries. He intertwined hagiographic medieval literary traditions with history writing, and thus connected the historical narrative of the glorious past with his time. In Paisius' work, the holiness of the dynasty founded by Saint Simeon and the continuity of church autonomy attained by his son, Saint Sava, were perceived as the highest sources of the legitimacy of contemporary Serbian church institutions. Nevertheless, the reach of these intellectual trends was limited to the literate circles, which consisted mainly of clerics and a small number of educated merchants and craftsmen. Among the wider population, the commemoration of the founding diet and their cult, together with the historical memory of the medieval statehood, was spread and furthered by the traveling monks. One of important aspects of the economies of the Orthodox monasteries in the Ottoman Balkans was dispatching of monks to collect alms among their co-religionists. And some of the monastic centers were able to develop wide networks that spanned all of the Balkan Peninsula. Monastery Mileševa, that was closely tied with the cult of Saint Sava, was one of the most influential Serbian monasteries during the 16th century, and it had a far-reaching cultural impact. Together with Mileševa, throughout the Ottoman period, one of the central religious institutions among the Orthodox Serbs was Monastery Hilandar. This monastery had great symbolical power, because, as it is already mentioned, it was founded jointly by Saint Simeon and Saint Sava. Hilandari monks enjoyed special respect, and while traveling, they brought with them the holy relics, and through preaching, furthered the commemoration of the Holy Diet. In their correspondence, especially numerous in the 18th century, they systematically stressed and revived those ties with the monastery's holy founders. This close connection between monasteries as sacred places and the memory of the founding saints acquired new qualities during the 18th century. Wars of the end of the 17th century brought about significant geopolitical changes in the northern parts of the Balkan Peninsula. The Ottomans lost the land situated to the north of the rivers Sava and Danube to the Habsburgs. At the same time, the war started several waves of migrations of Serbs to the lands under the Austrian rule. One of the consequences of these trends was formation of a new religious center. While the institutions of the Patriarchate of Peć persisted until the second half of the 18th century, gradually the prelates that presided in the town of Sremski Karlovci in the Habsburg lands attained the greatest authority among the Serbian clergy. The political work of Patriarch of Peć, Arsenius IV, who after migrating to the Habsburg monarchy in 1737 relinquished the patriarchal throne and became the Metropolitan Archbishop of Sremski Karlovci, was deeply influenced by the current political and cultural trends in Central Europe. He successfully incorporated the commemoration of the Holy Diet into his political program. The main goal was to defend and strengthen his own political and religious authority by adapting to the contemporary political discourse. The collective memory of the Holy Dynasty and the medieval past was systematically propagated and reshaped through historical narratives and art. The engravings of monasteries Studenica, the resting place of Saint Simeon in Hilandar, were circulated among the believers. And as you can see here, there are Saint Simeon and Saint Sava on the top, surrounding the Holy Trinity and the Virgin Mary. At the same time, by trying to show that there was uninterrupted continuity between the age of the Holy Diet and the modern period, Arsenius IV used Baroque approach to historical narratives in order to make his arguments understandable and acceptable to the public that was far removed from the Orthodox Balkan cultural circle, namely to the Habsburg rulers in Vienna. He commissioned a series of paintings and engravings, which, while still using some medieval models and patterns, mixed them with contemporary symbolical imagery. By analyzing the problem of commemoration of Saint Simeon and Saint Sava during a long period of time, we strive to show how a cultural and religious phenomenon created in the medieval times could be transformed and adapted to different political and social circumstances. The Holy Diet remained one of the most used ideological symbols in the period research in this paper, at the same time representing timeless ideals and an idealized past on the one hand, and being adapted to concrete needs of the moment on the other. And as you can see in this late painting of the late 18th century, the imagery of Saint Simeon and Saint Sava is completely incorporated in the Baroque art of the Habsburg land, where the two Serbian saints are in front of the Jesus Christ who wears the Habsburg regalia, and their crown and a sword in front of Saint Simeon as a relinquishment of the world power and just retaining the religious power, and thus strengthening the claim to religious autonomy while accepting the political rule of Habsburg. So that was all, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maria and Ognjen. In fact, we have some talks in this Congress about Serbian culture and uses of the Middle Ages. So there might be some people on the audience that have some questions about this paper. And now we move on to the next one, which is by Friedrich Richter. I think it's pronounced this way, and my apologies again for your name being incorrect on the program of the Congress. So Friedrich Richter is a research fellow at Humboldt University, Universität zu Berlin, and a PhD student in Scandinavian studies at the Universität Zurich. She has studied Scandinavian studies and art history in Berlin and Copenhagen, and amongst her research interests are pre-modern manuscript and book culture in Scandinavia and digital humanities, history of Scandinavian medieval studies, as well as the relevance of the Middle Ages and medieval studies for the present age. And her paper today is Familiar Faces, the Increased Interest in Odin. I don't understand, it's Thor, right? Yes, Thor and Loki in early modern Iceland. I'm sorry for the, because the this graphy is not familiar to us, but I believe it's Thor.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. Yes, good evening from Berlin. I'm very happy to be able to partake in this wonderful conference and also be allowed to actually present something. So I'm very excited about that, and I'm going to start my presentation. Please let me know if this is not going to work, but I hope so. So I suppose you can see it all. Yeah. Wonderful. Good. Yes. My paper will take you to 18th century Iceland by providing a discussion of 3 paper manuscripts that were produced there. These 3 paper manuscripts contain, amongst others, the 2 main medieval literary collections on Norse mythology that are both the Eddic poems as well as Prose Edda, which is also often called Snorra Edda, both narrating the myths of Odin, Thor, and Loki, and all the other Aesir. The oldest surviving medieval manuscripts of Prose Edda date from 14th century, and it seems that thereafter the work had sunken into oblivion. It was not before 17th century the interest in it boosted again, a phenomenon the 3 paper manuscripts I'm going to talk about are a fascinating example for. Today's paper will focus on Prose Edda and why it was made relevant for the readers in 18th century, arguing that it was not only because of the myths of Odin, Thor, and Loki, but also because it was regarded as medieval literature. Yes, I will go on and present an overview of today's talk. Next, I will say a few words about antiquarianism and the role Icelandic manuscripts were attributed to it. Thereafter, I will introduce the paper manuscripts and the interesting feature they all are equipped with, the extended prologue to Prose Edda. Subsequently, I will present 3 items from this extended prologue that are title pages, a genealogy of Odin, and 1 of the additional prefaces. I will end with a conclusion. I will now move on to introduce some aspects of the relation of Icelandic manuscripts and Scandinavian antiquarianism. The Icelandic age of antiquarianism was called Lærdomsöld, the age of learnedness. The most influential scholar during this period was Arngrimur Jónsson Lærði, the learned, who drew with his works international attention to the opulence of medieval literature as it was preserved on Icelandic manuscripts. This led to a huge interest in Icelandic manuscripts in 17th and 18th century, especially in Denmark and Sweden. At this time, Iceland had been dependent under the Danish-Norwegian crown for quite some centuries. From an antiquarian perspective, the Icelandic manuscripts were believed to deal with the early history of the respective Scandinavian kingdoms and people. Because of this, thousands of Icelandic manuscripts were shipped abroad, and antiquarians were employed by the Scandinavian kings to study the literature and prepare first editions of these texts. One of these first editions has been made of Prose Edda that was printed in Copenhagen in 1665. The title page you can see on the slide. It was only after the constitution of the Icelandic Republic and after dragging negotiations with Denmark that a significant number of medieval manuscripts was finally brought back to Iceland in the second half of 20th century. And you see the first manuscripts delivered back on the right side. I will now move on to introduce the manuscripts I'm working with. There are 3 Icelandic paper manuscripts that share the following characteristics and that I have chosen to work with. They all contain an early modern compilation of Prose Edda. They were either completely or at least mainly written and illuminated by the same scribe who's called Jakob Sigurðsson in the 1760s. Actually, it's quite interesting. He was an unschooled tenant farmer who made some earnings with his writing and drawing talent. All these manuscripts are extraordinarily illuminated, including a number of illustrations of the Norse gods and myths as they are narrated in Prose Edda. They are complex compilations, not only including Prose Edda and a number of Eddic poems, but also learned treatises and other varying material. It is indeed quite remarkable that Icelanders had kept on writing most of their books tediously by hand at this time. This is usually explained by the fact that the church owned the only printing press for many centuries. However, I will show you that handwriting also facilitated the quasi-medieval and thus more flexible approach to book production. For example, one element of rewriting Prose Edda in 18th century is in fact the most fascinating feature of these three paper manuscripts, a phenomenon I'll call the extended prologue, and which I will briefly introduce to you now. Already, the medieval versions of Prose Edda included a so-called prologus. Its function is to integrate the following narratives of Norse myth within the Christian worldview and embellish them with learnedness. Starting with the Christian narrative of the creation, including Adam, it establishes the Aesir, the Norse gods, as migrating from Asia, that is Troy, to Scandinavia, where they were conceived more like gods than men. Thus it makes use of euhemerism in order to avoid conflict with the Christian religion. In the three manuscripts I'm talking about today, this prologus is massively supplemented with further prefatory items that were apparently compiled to include as much material as available that was regarded as having some kind of relation to Prose Edda. In the following case studies, I will argue that here it becomes evident why Prose Edda is included into these books at all, and that it is because it was conceived as medieval literature and presented as such. These manuscripts are generally occupied with the past in which Prose Edda is attributed a key position. I will now discuss three items from the extended prologue, and these are the title pages, a genealogy of Odin, and one of the prefaces. I'll analyze conceptions of the past that are negotiated in the manuscripts. This past is never labeled the Middle Ages, but from all what is evident, it is a concluded past that is clearly distinct from the manuscripts present. Analyzing the extended prologue can gain valuable insight into the interests and attitudes in Prose Edda at that time and its relevance to the contemporary present, that is the 1760s. So let's start with the title pages. A detail of this page you've already seen on the title of this presentation, and actually this one is indeed unique. Only this one of the title pages is equipped with illuminated medallions that illustrate Norse gods and myths as they are narrated in Prose Edda. It includes depictions of a one-eyed and smiling Odin on the top, with his name written in runes on his chest. At his side, the two ravens Hugin and Munin are placed. Furthermore, you'll see amongst others Valhalla, Heimdall, and Thor's hammer Mjolnir. These illuminations are quite entertaining and funny, and definitely draw a lot of interest to the Prose Edda within this manuscript. The text on the title pages of all three manuscripts is actually almost the same, but I've chosen to move on with the longest version, so we have to leave the illuminations, unfortunately. The text on this title page summarizes the transmission of Prose Edda to its readers. The one on it announces the first stages of transmission The announcement of the first stage of transmission is the most prominent one in terms of size and design, and it reads, and I will read the English translation now, this book Edda that was put together by Snorri Sturluson, lawman, Anno Christi 1215. Some of this information was in fact already mentioned as in one of the medieval manuscripts, that is Codex Opsaliensis. According to its initial rubric, the compilation has the title Edda, and is attributed to Snorri Sturluson. The two other pieces of information, the dating of 1215 and the fact that Snorri has been the central law speaker in Iceland, probably derive from the title page of the first printed edition. What is remarkable, though, is that Snorri is not just referred to in his role as literary compiler, but also that he was relevant as a historical figure, as the law speaker holding the highest rank at the Icelandic Alþingi. In this way, Prose Edda is located within the period of the so-called Icelandic Commonwealth period, or Þjóðveldið, that was before the Iceland had submitted to the Norwegian king. This brings me to the remaining lines of the title page, which moves on like this. Prose Edda, or Edda, was printed in Copenhagen in Icelandic, Danish, and Latin Anno Domini 1665. By including the reference to the first printed edition in faraway Copenhagen and listing the three languages, the title page highlights Prose Edda's widespread relevance, perhaps even implying the significance of what we today would call an export hit. The last line, it's referred to the last stage of transmission and thus to the very manuscript itself. And it was written in Kirkjubæur in the Eastfjords anno 1760. By linking this paper manuscript to both the already discussed medieval compilation as well to the first printed edition, the title page establishes an idea of a linear transmission. Here, the tiny place of Kirkjubæur in the remote Icelandic Eastfjords is related to other important issues, the Icelandic Free State and one of its most important persons, and the international attention Prose Edda had received around 100 years earlier with the printed book. Prose Edda is highlighted as highly relevant to the Icelandic readers in spite of its 550 years of age, or in fact, exactly for this very reason. It becomes evident that at this time it must have been a sophisticated medieval book to read and own, which is also supported by the decoration and the illuminated title page I have showed you earlier. I now turn to another interesting feature of the manuscripts, and this is the genealogy of Odin. All three manuscripts include a list of the genealogy of Odin, which is in fact quite peculiar. It starts with Christian creation, listing amongst others Adam, Noah, and moving over to Saturn, Jupiter, and the Trojan king Priam. Odin is placed approximately in its middle, written in emphasized script. Until here, the list is very much according to the humoristic accounts of the medieval prologus. What, however, is much more interesting is the list of descendants of Odin. The list proceeds to the Völsungs and then to actual historical Icelanders. This direct line is based on the myth that one of the first Icelandic settlers, who is called Höfðar Þórður, I've also made a square around his name. This is one of the first Icelandic settlers, and he was a descendant of the Völsungs that were descendants of Odin, according to the myth. Already the medieval prologus did give account for several of Odin's descendants who became rulers in some European countries as Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, but it does not explicitly integrate Iceland into the narrative. What is interesting, however, is the fact that the line of the genealogy here terminates with Jón Arason, the famous last Catholic bishop of Iceland who was executed in 1550. So all of you who have been to Simon Harling's paper know a little bit about Jón Arason already, just a few minutes ago. So in this way, the list continues much further down into Icelandic history and carrying on for centuries far beyond the compilation of Prose Edda. It is an interesting question why genealogies were integrated into the manuscripts. My suggestion is that they deepen conceptions of the past and link them to more recent centuries, establishing a non-withstanding mythical but continuous line from the creation all the way up to the Icelandic Reformation. In this way, they cover the time span of what must have been regarded as belonging to the past in the 1760s, coming to an end with the years-long conflicts of the enforced Reformation in Iceland. This past appears finalized, perhaps based on the perception that after the Reformation, the current system was established. I will now move on with the last example. And this is preface number 3. The extended prologue does also include 4 additional early modern prefaces. These shed different perspectives on Prose Edda, and the most interesting is, in my view, the third one, which I'm going to show you here. It mainly deals with idealizing the past while mourning cultural decay of its contemporary time. Both a common cultural identity and the idea of past as explicit, both a common cultural identity and the idea of past are explicitly addressed when it refers to both our common ancestors and our country. The past is mainly imagined as characterized by learnedness in an overly idealized period, a kind of golden age. To this past, Prose Edda is considered central. It is stated that most people were literate back then until an unlearning of reading has led to the cultural decay of the present days that is also accompanied by a lack of books. The description of the contemporary culture includes harsh arguments on its people, blaming them for ignorance and self-centered lifestyles. However, the good news is that reading books, and especially Prose Edda, which is considered one of the most useful books, this can help to leave the misery. So there's this quote. And this I say truly, that this book is amongst those people deem useless, but it is one of the most useful ones. In this preface, language and literacy are regarded as important competencies of culture and country, and Prose Edda is assigned a central role to it. So the medieval literature was considered a kind of cure-all in those devastating times. Now I'd like to continue with a short summary of the findings of the paper. I discussed 3 items of the extended prologue of 3 Icelandic Prose Edda manuscripts from the 1760s, title pages, genealogy of Odin, and preface number 3. What becomes evident is that Prose Edda enters these manuscripts because it was considered literature of a past that we today call the Middle Ages, a past that was highly relevant to the contemporaries that produced, commissioned, bought, and read these manuscripts. There are 3 astonishing examples of many manuscripts that witnessed the interest boost both in this work but also in the Middle Ages in general at this time. Thus, it is not only the narratives of the myths of Odin, Thor, and Loki they were concerned with, but also with the era of mythography, which is the point of reference that appears historicized and glorified. Hereby, the manuscripts reveal an antiquarian interest from Icelandic perspective, which in fact is still relevant today, as Prose Edda, or as it is most often called, Snorra Edda, is still considered one of the central works of Icelandic medieval literature. Yes, thank you very much. This was my paper.
Thank you, Friederike. And we have in this Congress, we also have some papers on Scandinavian culture and medievalism. So probably there might be some interest in the audience. And we move on for the final paper in this session, which is by Saga Fetzar. Saga Fetzar is a has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Art History and Book Science at the Friedrich Alexander University in Nuremberg. And in the same university, she did her Master of Arts degree in Medieval and Renaissance Studies, Art History, and Medieval History. And since 2018, she is a scientific associate, lecturer, and PhD student of the program of the Volkswagen Foundation Modeling Cultural History from the Institute of Art History from the same university in Nuremberg. Her research interests are museum history, collecting, and medievalism in the 19th century, object and provenance research from the 15th to the 19th centuries, in painting, graphic, and sculpture of the late Middle Ages. And today she's presenting the paper Reconstructing the Middle Ages, Genealogies of the Germanisches National Museum as Early Exhibition Concepts. So I give you the word, Sarah.
Good evening from my side. First, I would like to thank the committee of the conference for inviting me, and I will start my presentation in a second. Let's start right off. You may have heard of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum as the greatest cultural historical museum in Germany, and you also may have heard that Baron Hans von und zu Aufseß was the one who came up with the idea of founding the museum in the first place. Hans von Aufseß was born in 1801, a member of the Franconian nobility and one of the best-known German collectors of that romantic era. Influenced by his family's roots and the historical paradigms of the 19th century, Aufseß started at a very early age to collect works of art, antiquities, books and archives, all of which came from the German Middle Ages. My dissertation project is devoted to the investigation and examination of the history of the Aufseß collection, which addresses a research dissertation. Based on the known biographical facts about the museum founder as a collector, for the first time, the focus of research is on the questions about the composition and purpose of his wide-ranging collection. I also take a closer look at the Baron's extensive collector and scholar network, including his collecting and trading strategies. Another research gap is the investigation of the modeling of the collection and the resulting narrative strategies in Castle Unteraufseß and in the spatial program of the museum before 1857, which requires a comparison with other collector personalities and museum foundations of that time. The starting point of the methodological approach is the inheritance of the museum founder in the family archive in Castle Unteraufseß, which contains valuable documents on the history of the collection and has so far only been marginally considered by research. The estate is also an excellent addition to the museum history archives of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum. Up until now, these have also been examined peripherally with regard to the question of the Aufseß collection and its later whereabouts in the museum. In this context, an investigation of selected collection objects provides further clues to their history of acquisition and origin. Finally, visiting of key locations such as Castle Unteraufseß and the Nuremberg Castle complex are in the foreground of my reflection on the Aufseß exhibition concepts. As you can see, my doctoral thesis covers a wide range of topics. In the following, I will discuss how the motivation for collecting and the personal meaning of objects have changed from the beginning of Aufseß's collecting career until the founding of the museum in 1852. In addition, the extent to which this was expressed in the conception of his collection objects in the private rooms of Castle Unteraufseß and in the museum's public exhibition program from 1852 to 57 will be discussed. This leads finally to the question what image of the medieval past the exhibition concept presented to the museum visitors. Aufseß, who had taken over the sole administration of the family estates at a young age, had been in contact with prominent architects, master builders, and collectors since 1821 and created extensive plans for the medieval redesign and furnishing of his headquarters, Castle Unteraufseß, particularly for the Knights' Chapel. The American historian Susan Crane already demonstrated in her research on collecting in the 19th century Germany that Hans von Aufse's collection objects were directly related to his noble ancestors, the Nile legacy, ultimately to his own biography, and in this sense, primarily understood as historical sources. This leads me to the question how Susan Crane's theoretical considerations related to Aufse's collection concept and to the fact that Aufse's exhibited the medieval past rather than any other time period. Together with his college friend, the lawyer, author, and painter Friedrich Hofstadt, Aufse's aim was to give his castle an authentic medieval appearance. A large part of the objects in the Knight's Chapel were directly related to the Aufse's family and thus to their own family history, while the row of blazons on the long sides of the chapel were intended to commemorate all the feudal lords of the Aufse's nobility. The later added glass paintings, partly original Gothic, partly Neo-Gothic, related directly to Aufse's biographical stations, with the integration of shields in the spandrels next to the Aufse's blazon of his wife's family, the von Seckendorfs. Aufse's also integrated an old font with a relief depicting 8 Franconian knights from the 16th century, which he had acquired from the castle church in the neighboring village in December 1835 on his friend's advice. It is not surprising that not only the historical biographical reference to the objects, but also their art historical significance played a major role in the redesign of the Unteraufseser Knight's Chapel. Not without reason, the historian Heinrich Meyer described the chapel during his visit in 1930 as a room with a museum-like abundance. For the altarpiece, Hofstadt had originally planned a neo-Gothic concept, but not satisfied with his friend's attempt, and after a long search, Aufse's was able to acquire a retabule from the Albrecht Dürer era. The medieval redesign of the Knight's Chapel was inspired by regional models, for example the Swan Knight's Chapel of the St. Gumbertus Church in the Franconian city of Ansbach. The furnishings in the Unteraufseser Knight's Chapel not only followed Aufse's own lineage, but he understood the arrangement within a larger context as a part of representative national history. The Baron had unequivocally taken up this concept when designing the exhibition for his collections in the first rooms of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum. Therefore, the so-called Aufse's collection found its place in a tower belonging to the Nuremberg castle complex and in the former patrician house. The neo-Gothic interior design of the commonly called Tiergartner Tor Tower was intended to give visitors a comprehensive picture of the medieval cultural history of the German-speaking era, based on the style of medieval German houses. The first floor, the so-called weapon hall, contrasted with the domestic life on floor 3. Floor 2 and 4 had a meaningful title, Medieval German Picture Galleries, not forgetting the connection to its own origins and the Nuremberg aristocratic network. Aufse's, for example, integrated a large glass bowl with the Nuremberg patrician blazon into the spatial program on floor 3 of the tower. Another highlight that directly related to Aufse's passion for music was an exhibited double piano. In the so-called Tobler House, an old patrician estate, Aufse's temporarily housed the archive, the library, the general repertory, as well as the graphic collection, coins, seals, and smaller sculptures in 6 rooms. Until his collection was sold to the museum, a large part of the private family archive from Kassel-Unteraufseß was also in the museum's holdings. The Baron considered works of art as preferable form of historical sources that would illustrate German national identity. His overarching goal, following the early guidelines of the museum, was to make these sources available to the public in order to support the emergence of a collective memory. Aufse's art historical interest in objects was also not lost in the Tiergärtner Tortower, although in his role as a mediator, his contemporaries had consistently described him as a mere amateur. Therefore, the museum chairman had hung the showpieces of his relatively small collection of paintings in prominent places, including St. Anna Seltrit by the German painter Michael Wohlgemuth and Hans Bleidenhoff's portrait of George Count von Löwenstein, objects that are still among the highlights in the museum collection today. One of the first museum visitors in the 19th century was the historian Wilhelm Dietz-Verwinger, who wrote a song of praise about the museum and the art and antiquity collection in the Tiergärtner Tortower. He wrote, "The German strolls into the archive of old German art and is amazed by what he beholds. A thrill runs through him as if he were in the presence of the sacred. From dark walls the masterworks shine down, those of the master Wohlgemuth, who lived here within Nuremberg's walls, who beautified his native town, and who taught Albrecht Dürer himself how best he should apply the brush artistically." As Dietz-Verwinger's appreciation for the individual works of art in Aufse's collection shows that visitors tended to follow their own path of reception rather than adhere to Aufse's intentions. In contrast to the early exhibition concepts of the Aufse's collection before 1857, the Baron succeeded in creating a historical representation of the German nation in the sense of visualized medieval images in the Nuremberg Charterhouse since 1857. These images were closely related to the basic ideas of the Parisian Musée des Monuments Français by Alexandre Lenoir and by Alexandre du Sommerard's Musée de Cluny, and thus based on international models. The brief glimpse into Aufse's collection history showed that the object meanings within a collection not only differed between collector and observers, but that the collector was able to assign different meanings to them over the course of time and according to the respective context. While the neo-Gothic redesign of Kassel-Unteraufseß was indebted to personal history and based on regional examples, the same objects in his early museum's collection concept were placed to call up the German nation to forge a collective national memory. In both cases, however, the quote from Aufse's acquaintance, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, sums it up nicely, who wrote in 1823, "Once the individual becomes aware of the objects, then he looks at them in relation to himself, and rightly so." Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah, for your paper. And now the discussion is open. We have to end the session maximum at about 5 minutes to 6, because we can't have this session simultaneous with the other one that starts at 6. So, but we still have some time. So you can have your questions. You can write your questions on the chat, or simply ask for permission, and we'll give you the microphone. So there's a question by Katarzyna. Thank you to all the speakers for these inspiring papers. I've learned a lot. My question is to Friederike. You have mentioned the reasons for the inclusion of the Snorra Edda in these manuscripts and its relevance for the historical present of the 18th century. I cannot resist to ask in which context Snorra Edda appears in these manuscripts, and whether you can expand on what this context can tell us about its position in the history of Icelandic literature and its reception in the 18th century. And there's a second question. It's about the image of the past that these manuscripts draw. You have mentioned that the scribes are romanticizing the Icelandic past as a golden age, which is characterized by a high level of learning. Do you see any political reference being woven into the prologues? For instance, the reference to the Commonwealth?
Yes, thank you very much. Wow, these are complex questions. I can perhaps start with the general conceptions of the past and these manuscripts. I mean, those extended prologues, they compile a lot of different material together that kind of shed different perspectives and angles on the Icelandic history or past. And it's quite interesting that the different eras or periods are assessed very differently. So for example, there's a drawing of Odin and there's a little caption saying that, yeah, well, this is the kind of idol people were used to pray to in those times. They were heathens and they were just, you know, they're described as dumb people, as people who were just not really, didn't know, were dumb people. They were just, they're assessed very badly. And actually, it's quite interesting that apparently the era of like the era of the literature, as we know, like from 13th century, the era of the later Middle Ages is assessed much more positively in this material. So somehow, shedding different lights on different eras of the history. So I think this is quite interesting. And when it comes to political aspects, I think it's these manuscripts have to be understood in terms of like some kind of proto-nationalistic material that is perhaps not nationalistic yet in the sense as we know it from 19th century, but they use words as thjóð, which is a people or nation, depending on when you kind of translate it. I mean, it's not the proper word for nation, but now it is used as nation. And they use different ideas on describing the Icelandisticness. Oh, sorry. So it's they are obsessed with the Icelandic past, with the Icelandic culture. So it is definitely within this kind of context you have to see it. And those manuscripts compile a lot of different texts that are all interested in the Icelandic past. So there are also some learned treatises on runology, for example, that is, at that time, people thought that runology or like runes were used to write, to be written, that the oldest Icelandic books were written in runes that apparently are not existing anymore, but this was what people believed at that time. So this is maybe like a brief answer to what you have asked, though it's much more complex than that. But thank you very much for your very good question.
Katarzyna, I don't know if you want to add something or can...
No, sure. Just thank you very much, Rika. I was rather thinking with the first question, you mentioned that other texts dealing with runes appear in those manuscripts. Are those like native texts written in Iceland, or are they influenced by what's happening in Denmark at the time? Because you mentioned that they make explicit references to the publication of Snorra Edda in Denmark. So I was just wondering whether this sort of material also gets somehow sneaked into the Icelandic manuscripts later on, if you remember.
You mean well, the learned treatises are actually Icelandic ones on runes and runology, but what is quite interesting, for example, some parts of the prefatory poem in the printed Edda in Denmark is actually written in runes, which is also copied in the manuscripts, and the manuscripts are partly copied from this printed one. So there's a very complex interaction between the antiquarian actions in Denmark and the Icelandic manuscript productions, and it's almost impossible to kind of divide them, but it's some kind of, I would interpret them as some kind of reclaim of the material from what has been printed in Denmark back to Iceland.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for your answer.
So thank you. There's a question by Stefan. Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah, my question is for Maria and Ognian. Thank you for a very systematic overview of the topic. And while I was listening to you, I was thinking, was thinking in terms of, okay, so we have continuity and we have change, and this interplay of continuity and change. So I was thinking about your opinion. Are these two cults, or the joint cult, would you characterize them as exception or a rule in the general atmosphere of these changing circumstances of early modern empires, of the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Empire, and changing borders, cultural circumstances, social, and so on? So how would you, just wanted to see, how would you evaluate them in that sense?
Did I unmute? Can you hear me? So thank you for your question. My opinion is that it is rather a rule than an exception. We chose Saint Sava and Simeon to talk about them only because they're probably the most prominent and most important medieval cults, but with every other cult of the saints. For example, the cult of King Stefan Dechanski. In the wake of the Ottoman threat, his cult was completely reinvented, because until the end of the 14th century, he was venerated just one among the holy kings. But from then on, he was venerated as a martyr, because at that moment, Serbian society needed some martyrs in order to build their own identity. So I would say that it is actually a rule. But I think we have the most sources, and the best way to portray it were the cults of Saint Simeon and Sava. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. There's a question by Claudia. It's a question for Sarah. I'm intrigued by the name of this museum. That it's really intriguing to me. That's called Germanisches rather than Deutsches Museum. The two adjectives are far from synonyms. In fact, their semantic spectrum has constantly been readjusted in time and different languages, often with tricky ideological implications. I wonder whether you briefly could comment on this.
Sure, I can. And it's a question that is asked really a lot. Also, the museum visitors always ask, why is it not a German museum? Why is it called the Germanisches Nationalmuseum? So the roots within this lie in the 19th century. Aufsatz was a friend to the two authors, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and they studied the Germanistic literature. And the museum not only should include objects referring to Germany as the geographical nation, so, to Germany as, but instead to Germany as to the German-speaking era, which was called in the 19th century, Germanistisch in German. So there's quite a difference, but to be honest, the museum objects today that are collected are mostly objects that refer to the German nation. So it was debated a few years ago if the museum should be called the German National Museum and not Germanisches National Museum. It's a debate, yeah, that's trend now in the museum again. And yeah, thank you very much for your question. I hope, yeah, I could answer your question, but it's complex. It's very complex.
Thank you, Sarah. Any further questions? I also have a question related with this to Sarah, which is about if you have inquired about the later reception of these museums exhibitions in Germany. Probably, you know, like because you mainly addressed the period of the foundation, but I was wondering, I never visited this museum. I visited other museums in Germany, but I was wondering how the public or the critiques saw these exhibitions, or if these collections have been politically appropriated. I don't know, perhaps later on in its history.
The museum's exhibition concept changed a lot since the 19th century. So Aufsus moved with his co-workers to the Nuremberg Charter House, as I said. And the Charter House is the place where the museum stands today. But there were a lot of, it was a big transition process until today. So it's a modern building that includes many, many rooms. And sometimes the museum visitors got lost. So the museum's rooms changed from the 19th century until today. But today, one of the main, how's it called? The main tasks of the museum is to recreate these rooms from the 19th century to show the visitors who come today in the museum how it was in the 19th century, how the objects were presented in the 19th century. And that is what I'm working on.
Thank you. So seems there are no any further questions. If not, I would like to thank you all for this session, very interesting session, and we'll end this one as we have to start the next one at 6. So thank you all for your work, and the audience for the attention and the interesting questions, and see you soon.